second half hour. And so, great. How about if I share my screen? Let me just, uh, here we go. Just a second. Yeah, this will probably take a couple minutes anyway. Um, okay, great. Can everybody see my screen or, I mean, can I only ask one person? Can
Yes,
any,
looks good, Charles.
okay, thank you very much. Okay, again, my name is Charles Hart. I'm with the Catalyst program. And what I'm going to do for this first half hour is I'm going to say a few words about the UCSF Catalyst program, and then I'm going to say a few words about the target product profile and the role it plays in healthcare product development, in industry and government. I'm going to say a bit about the Catalyst Summer Internship program, and I'm going to finish off talking about the medical fields of the target product profile, which is the first set of fields that all the interns are going to create this summer. And then I'm going to introduce Ray Minkowski, who's going to give the second half of the workshop tonight. And so, actually, I first want to start off by thanking all of you that have joined the call. In particular, I want to thank the other Catalyst program staffers, Nate Prorock, Rupa Ramamurthy, and Sohaila Shah, that are on the call. And you're going to get, some of you are going to get to know each of them very well, and others sort of peripherally. I want to thank all the Catalyst Award principal investigators that are on the call for their projects and volunteering to participate this summer. I want to thank everybody from the UCSF Office of Innovation Ventures, especially the case managers, the business development case managers that work on these same projects with the investigators. And finally, I want to say, most importantly, I want to thank all the Catalyst interns that have volunteered this summer. Um, we hope this is a worthwhile venture for you. We appreciate you participating. Um, if you have any questions or suggestions or comments, you can let me know or the other Catalyst staffers. And then for any of the Catalyst industry advisors joining, I want to thank you as well, especially. Okay, so I'm going to move on. And so the Catalyst program is one of 6 programs within Innovation Ventures at UCSF, which is basically the tech transfer office at large. And I'm not going to go through all these other programs, but they have to do with commercializing inventions, working with the investigators, entrepreneurship, and the like. We're actually part of a larger network of efforts involving entrepreneurship and innovation, both on the UCSF campus as well as other UCs and the Bay Area at large, and actually, regionally and nationally and internationally as well. The Catalyst programs focused on helping UCSF professors and postdocs and trainees and staffers and anybody at UCSF that has an idea, an invention, or discovery that could possibly advance along the translational path to commercialization. And we really have 3 different sort of programs. The Catalyst Awards, which again provides seed funding and advice and mentorship to the awarded principal investigators. We have the Catalyst Launchpad that's focused on entrepreneurship that Nate's going to talk about in a couple of weeks. And we have the summer internship program that we're here for today that have students and trainees from both UCSF as well as other local institutions and other, actually, some that aren't so local. And the focus is to create target product profiles for the Catalyst Award teams. And the overarching goal of Catalyst is to help these projects advance along the translational path, and hopefully exit as, partnerships with industry or startup companies or into other accelerator or incubator type programs. Catalyst supports projects, again, across all aspects of healthcare product development, primarily drugs, tests, devices, and digital. And our advisors, I already said this, are absolutely key. We have about 100 volunteer industry advisors that cover all aspects of healthcare product development. I've just put these in the boxes around toxicology, regulatory affairs, statistics, prototypes, and reimbursement, just to highlight a couple. This is the list of this year's Catalyst projects. I already saw Reese Knight here on the phone with a question. I'm not going to go through these. I'll just mention that the ones that the red asterisks, those are co-funded by the Weil Institute of Neurosciences at UCSF that we're very appreciative of. And the cell therapy projects are co-funded by the Living Therapeutics Initiative at UCSF that we're also very appreciative of. Catalyst program has been going since 2010. Almost 300 projects have been awarded. They've been awarded over $12 million. And those same projects have subsequently raised a lot of money in follow-on funding. Okay, great. I'm going to change now to the second topic, which is the TPP. Just across these 4 bullets, a target product profile is really a description of what you hope the project will look like at the very end. And so if you look at the second bullet, it really embodies, that's funny. I was reading about these words that tell you if something's artificially intelligence written, if ChatGPT wrote it. And I thought, and the word is delve. And so if you see something that has delve in it, it's a good chance ChatGPT wrote it. Actually, I used the word delve, and now I'm going to stop using it. I think embody is probably the same type thing. Anyway, TPPs embody, beginning with the end in mind. And if you look at the bottom bullet, it really identifies the optimal and minimal product attributes. And in the case of drugs, and if you go to the pharmacy and you get your pill box and you open it up, and there's that super thin paper that you can almost see through, that piece of paper is called, well, it's called the package insert. It's also called the product label. It's also called the prescribing information. All 3 of those words mean the exact same thing. I apologize. I just realized that there was a box blocking stuff, and it was blocking what I was just saying. And so this is the first 3 pages of Trulicity's package insert. These are used by different parties. For example, in industry, they're used to guide product development. Venture capitalists use them to help decide if they're going to invest in a company. The FDA uses them as a form of communication, and the World Health Organization uses them to set targets for global health projects. This is just a snapshot, sorry, of what the target product profile fields are. This is just for 2 of them. This is just for the drug projects or the therapeutics projects on the left and medical device projects on the right. And if you note the top and bottom in bold black text on both sides, and then you note the fields in the middle, they're gray and faint, or gray text and not in bold. The ones in black and gold are sort of common across all tracks, regardless of what the modality is, whether it's a drug or a test or a medical device. And those are things like, what's the clinical indication? What's the need? What is this product doing to help people? What's the competitive landscape about either other products doing the same thing or other people trying to do the same thing you're doing? And then if you look at the four at the bottom, those are things like the opportunity to get patents or trademarks or copyrights, and the that's extremely important for a drug. It can be important for a digital health, and it ranges in the next three are the regulatory path to get it approved by the FDA in the United States and the other regulatory bodies elsewhere in the world. The question of who's going to pay for it is super important. And in fact, the second talk tonight, excuse me, the second talk today by Ray is going to touch on this. And then finally, the market opportunity and what's the commercial potential. And then the ones in the middle, the gray ones, are sort of specific to whether it's a drug or a test or a device or a digital health thing. Um, and then the other thing I want to say at a TPP, it's sort of jargony and it's sort of specific, and there's other instruments or documents, tools that do the same, that are basically the same thing. And if you look at the top half of this, these are three other things, excuse me, that are basically the same thing. And they have different names. In fact, this top one, sorry, I got to take another sip. Excuse me. If anyone's wondering, I actually do have COVID-19. I'm here by myself. Actually, I feel fine, but I've got this cough that you've already noticed. And I'm sorry, but I got a big jug of water here. So minimum viable product, MVP. Many of you have heard this term probably, and it's actually even more commonly used, especially in the areas of medical devices, digital health, and I think diagnostics as well. But my background is therapeutics, and my personal experience twice has been with target product profiles construction. Um, a product development plan, a PDP, is analogous. A design and development plan, which is used in medical device development, and it's actually the more common term, is a design and development plan. And then at the bottom, I want to introduce something, or not introduce it necessarily. I want to say something, which is two partner documents for those at the top, the ones at the top being TPP, MVP, PDP. Two companion documents are a clinical development plan, which is a much more detailed plan for getting your product through, if it needs clinical trials or if it needs clinical profiling. And then finally, the risk management plan and a risk register, they're really powerful documents that help you advance things in development and keeping your eye on the things that could go wrong. And just in passing, it turns out that two of our projects this summer, two of the awards actually already have target product profiles. And for those two teams, they're thinking about putting together one of these ancillary documents rather than a TPP. Okay, let me answer this while I take a sip. Are there any questions before I move to, and I'm almost done, before I move to strategies to fill the medical fields of the TPP, which are the fields that are somewhat in common across all projects, which are the fields that we're first going to sink our teeth in starting, I think, this week or next week. Any questions? Nate, I can't really see the screen, so, or just shout them out, or if not, it's completely fine.
No
Okay, great.
question. You can keep going.
I'm going to keep going. Thank you, Nathaniel. Okay. Since I've got this screen here, I want to mention something that even though I emailed this to all of you, and and actually you might have gotten it more than once from more than one person. What we're doing this summer, so we've been doing this for like I don't know, 6 years now or something. And every summer we try to learn from the previous summer, from the summer before, on, what worked well, what could we do, what could we do anything different this summer. We always sort of tweak things a bit. And actually, this is only relevant for people that have been involved before, because to the rest of you, it's like, oh, it's this summer. It's this summer. I don't care about years past. But what we're doing this summer, and I don't really want to say as an experiment because we think this is a better way to do it, but we'll see, is that we're going to fill the TPP fields. We're going to create the content for the TPP fields sort of sequentially by sort of area. And so the first area is the medical fields of the TPP. And so those are the ones that you see on the slide here. If you look to the left column, these are the one. Yeah, and then you can see in the right column, like, let's say the details or just explaining what the left column's saying. And so the medical fields of the TPP, vary a bit from product type to product type. This is sort of an example that's sort of generic, I think. Um, Although having said that, I should say that some of the digital health projects, they're not really therapeutic necessarily, and so there's not necessarily a standard of care. So I'm just acknowledging that because I know that. But if you look at the left column, these different fields of the medical fields of the TPP are like the indication. I mean, is this for cervical cancer? What is the disease or what is the setting, et cetera, et cetera? And is it subdivided by, the stage of the grade or the extent or the like, et cetera, et cetera. And then the next field is, how is this indication currently taken care of? I mean, what are doctors and nurses and other healthcare providers doing right now for patients that have it? And given what they're doing right now, the third field is, well, what do they need? What improvements can be made? And presumably your product is one of those and will hopefully become part of the standard of care. And the fourth one is really, really important in 2024. It was less so in 2014 or 2004 or 1994, is that, are there a way to identify the ideal patient for your treatment? There's this expression called precision medicine, and it refers to, the right drug at the right time at the right dose for the right patient. And so it really brings together both diagnostics and therapeutics. Sometimes it's referred to as theranostics, but it's really, if you think about 23andMe, you think about, sequencing the human genome, there's just going to be a lot of work in the next 10 years trying to figure out exactly what you have as a patient, and as opposed to one size fits all. And so if there's the opportunity to come up with a biomarker, a diagnostic, you want to know it and you want to factor that in. And the FDA is just all about that, not surprisingly, as they should be. And then the last one's clinical trials. And so the medical fields of the TPP are what we're going to do first, this week, next week, week after. And then we're going to move into the more technological fields, the more technical fields of the TPP. And those vary widely across all four tracks, right? And so, for example, if you look at the left here, in drugs, for drugs, you think about, oh, what are the cell-based models? You know, what are the predictors of toxicity? What are the predictors of efficacy? What are the clinical trials? And then if you look at the right, it's for a medical device, you know, what are the performance requirements? What are the safety aspects? What are the material requirements? How easy is it going to make? How much is it going to cost? Sorry. Oh my God. Okay. And so how are you interns going to get the data or excuse me, the information needed to fill these fields? Well, one, importantly, maybe most importantly, maybe this is all you need is hopefully you've been circulated both the application of the professor from September that was the basis for his award application, and then as well the PowerPoint finals presentation from a few months ago. And so both of these documents have the information you need, but you might want to go into greater detail, and that's admirable and fine and actually relevant because you do want to have, you know, current information. And databases around incidence and prevalence get updated every year. Now that it's already June, they might be updated for 2023 in terms of how many patients in the United States, you know, have this affliction or this condition. How many in the world have it? And those databases might be updated now that weren't updated for the professors last year. Now, one of the things that I think you've been provided, and I'm taking a chance. Hold on a second. I'm taking a chance. I'm going to click on this. Oh, I should have practiced. No, actually, I'm not going to take a chance because I should have practiced. Anyway, one, one of the items that you've been provided, and don't worry, I can't see this either. So it's actually, this is only funny to me, I realize. You've been provided a list of, you provided this database that we put together. And and this is sort of like a great thing for all of you, both now and in the future, assuming the hyperlinks are still hot in the future. And what these are is that for your particular disease, let's just say it's type 1 diabetes, that you can click on the metabolic disease, you know, health incidence and prevalence and facts and figures and find out, you know, how it's currently treated, how many people are getting it, et cetera, et cetera. And so I just want to point out that the focus of these workshops, these 5 workshops today, and then in a couple weeks, and then in a couple weeks, and then in a couple weeks, they're really intended to help you fill out the fields of the next set of fields that are to be filled out. And to say it for the third time, the medical fields are the first fields that you're going to fill out. And this, and again, they're pretty straightforward for you to fill out because the principal investigator already completed them in her or his application and her presentation. But importantly, if you interns have questions about the information and where you find it, don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Sohaila or to Nate or Rupa whoever's been assigned to you, to help facilitate. Um, what I'd say for what I want to say is, I just flashed on this, is it's better to reach out to us first before reaching out to the professor, I think. Something else I want to say that's super important that I should have said before that I'm going to say now is, and I did write it in an email to my teams, is the first thing that we want to happen after this thing, after tonight or after today, is, and actually this has already happened for some projects I happen to know, it hasn't happened for any of mine, is you want to have a meeting. There's going to be a meeting between the professor, the members of her or his team at UCSF working on this project, um, the summer interns working on this project, the Catalyst staffer facilitating this project, hopefully the Office of Technology Management and Advancements business development person, the TTO, the tech transfer officer that's working on this project, and maybe some ringers. Actually, a couple of these projects have outside consultants, and so maybe they would show up too. Goodness knows. But that first meeting, I want to say this, that first meeting is super important. Now, it might work out that some of you can't make it, but don't worry. You won't have missed anything important. No, I'm kidding. Don't worry if you can't make it. You'll get brought up to speed because it's important to have these earlier rather than later. And it's really hard to get a meeting on the calendar that everybody can make. But at that meeting, why it's so important is the professor will give an overview of the project. Each of you will introduce yourselves to each other, and you'll find out, what you're interested in working on, what your career interests are, what you're currently doing in school or out of school. Uh, and we'll just talk about how to divide and conquer on completing these TPPs. And that'll be a great opportunity to discuss the sources for information. And so each workshop is going to highlight the upcoming fields that will be completed and the resources for completing those. Um, but anyway, chances are what each of the projects are going to do is circulate one of those when to meet W2M polls or when to meet polls or a doodle poll or something like that, or one of those Google polls. And that first meeting will really be a chance for everyone to meet each other and really kick things off. That's the real kickoff. This is sort of the soft kickoff. Okay, I'm done, and I'm going to turn it over to the next speaker. And it's my pleasure to introduce Ray Makowski, who happens to be a good friend and a former coworker of Sohaila Shah, which is how we got turned on, how we got introduced to Ray. Ray and I have talked on the phone. I'm really looking forward, or I guess talked on a Zoom. I know those are different, trust me. We talked on a Zoom, and I think I'm really looking forward to the second half. Ray is a MD PhD from Tufts University in Boston, and he spent much of his career in industry. He worked at Bristol Myers Squibb. He worked at Genzyme. He worked at Epizyme. He worked at fantastic companies, Synovian. And he got into the thing that we're all doing, which is helping project teams advance their discoveries along the translational path. And he works for a medical and management consulting group called Nemitz. It's called the Nemitz Group. And they do exactly this, which is they're, consultants that help projects advance along the translational path to commercialization and patient benefit. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn the Zoom over to Ray Mankowski. I see him right on the call.
Well, thanks, Charles. Can you all hear me? Okay, that was a really nice introduction. I appreciate that. Someone can hear me?
Yes, we
Charles,
can.
you can hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay, fabulous. Now the next question is, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Even better. I have 2 for 2 today. That's awesome. Thank you. So it's my pleasure to have an opportunity to share with you to delve into the ChatGPT word, to delve into the reimbursement considerations in pharmacoeconomics field of the TPP. As Charlie mentioned, my bio is up here, but as he mentioned, my consultancy specializes a lot in helping companies do the soul searching that is really what becomes their TPP. Oftentimes, my biotech companies will have a target and they'll have a drug that activates that or stops that target, but they're not sure like which disease to use for treatment or where they should go or where they should launch or how to develop their clinical development program. And so we help them a lot with that. And I was just thrilled when Charles said at the beginning that you start with the end in mind, because the ultimate end in mind of the target product profile, and in my perspective, is someone actually going to pay for what you developed? And I think 5 or 10 years ago, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, a lot less attention was paid to this. And there was just a lot more free-range biotechnology development, I would say, without a lot of this being considered. But it's nice to see that this is on a TPP. And there are a lot of examples that are showing up around drugs which are approved, but there are challenges to get reimbursement for it. And I will say that even before that step, investors, when they're looking at companies, and again, at some of my small biotechs, even early on in development, they will ask the question, how do you think this is going to get reimbursed? Who is going to pay for it? And why would they pay for it? I see this with a lot of frequency. So I thought it might be helpful for today just to talk a little bit about the landscape, like what that means in terms of reimbursement and reimbursement strategy, and how companies think about managing that and how that evolves over the development of the asset. So in the United States, it is still kind of free range, I think, but all therapies, and this is primarily talking about therapeutic products, drug products, and so forth. There's a committee on every insurance plan or in every hospital, depending on the situation. And then there's also the government payers, where a drug, a therapeutic, is provided, information about it is provided to this committee, and they make a decision on whether it's something they would pay for or not pay for, or something in between. And frequently now, and within regulation, companies are going to these payers long before their phase 3 trial is done to ask them about what is the economic value that they expect from their drug. And the things on the left here, the criteria for formulary consideration, are the kinds of things that the payers are going to want to know about. And they're the kinds of things that Charles mentioned early on. Is there a need? Do we need this drug? You tell me this is a great drug for first-line treatment of X, but I've already got a first-line treatment for X that treats 95% of the patients and is generic and cheap. So do I need it? Does it work? Do I agree with the endpoints in your study? It's not just because an FDA approves a drug based on a study doesn't mean a payer has to provide that drug necessarily based on the evidence in the study. Europe is especially like this. Oncology and rare disease are a little bit different because of some regulations. Is it safe? Is it tolerable? How is it going to fit in to the current treatment paradigm? But most importantly, how much is this thing going to cost? This is the primary question that the payers are going to have. And you can have a great drug that treats a lot of people, but if it's going to completely stretch a payer's budget, then they're not going to be able to pay for other things. And so the people who are on these P&T committees are always weighing their options in terms of, if I pay for this, can I not pay for this? If I don't pay for this, can I now pay for this? If I do pay for this and it's got a bad adverse effect profile, like what other new costs am I going to engender? And then what payers in the US can do is they have all these little levers that they can pull in terms of getting access to a drug or not. So, for example, they can say, you know what, we need to have a healthcare practitioner say that you've got the disease, or we're going to restrict it to the label, or we're going to restrict it access to the patients who are in your clinical studies. Doesn't mean you can't get it. You can still pay out of pocket for a lot of these drugs, but that's very, very cost prohibitive. And they can go all the way down the line to saying, you know what, we'll give it to you, but you're going to have to stop it in 6 months to see if it's still working, or you can only get it at the hospital, or you're going to review it case by case. Now, if you think that sounds restrictive, Europe is a whole another ballgame when it turns when you're talking about getting access to drugs. So in Europe, not including the UK, in Europe, you get a regulatory approval from the EMA, and that's great. But then every country, although this is kind of centralized now, has what they call a health technology assessment, which is a group of payers getting together and saying, okay, EMA approved the drug. Do we agree with their opinion in terms of the efficacy and the safety? Regulatory bodies typically don't worry about the approval of a drug and the impact of the healthcare system at large. A health technology assessment will say, how does this drug fit in the paradigm of other medicines that I'm paying for? And if they agree to that, great. Then you still have to go to pricing and contracting negotiations with the various countries and say, we think the drug should cost X. And they will say, we think the drug should cost Y. And then you enter this loop of whether or not negotiating what your price is going to be. Something like this kind of happens in the United States with respect to contracting and rebates and all that kind of things. But the United States has an incredibly opaque and difficult to understand healthcare reimbursement system. So it all is kind of something that's happening behind the curtain. But in Europe, it's right out there in front. And then this is important when it comes to TPP. I'll come back to all this. Some markets, like the UK, will want to know, what am I getting for my buck, or my pound, rather, and is it worth it? Like I've said that you have said that your drug will reduce mortality by 3 years and it improves quality of life for a patient by this number. And you say it's going to cost £30,000 per year per patient for this number, but we set a threshold at 20. So you're going to have to negotiate that with us. And these are countries working in a fixed budget. Other markets like Germany, for example, will say, how relevant is this to the patient? And they will involve patients early on in the conversation around should a drug be reimbursed or not, or approved. Or in France, they'll talk about the clinical relevance of it. So all this comes back to the TPP, because again, with the end goal in mind, just because you get approval at the FDA or EMA or some of the other outside of US markets, doesn't mean it's actually going to find its way to patients. And there are examples of companies, Bluebird is a recent one, that have pulled out of Europe because they couldn't recoup the cost of their clinical studies. So how do you fill the box in? Especially if you've got, you're doing most of your work in the lab right now, you may not have a therapeutic idea in mind or reimbursement strategy. You can guess, and guessing is okay to start, because you're going to change your TPP over time. Some good guesses are that if you have a small molecule and the patient population is not big, there won't be a lot of restrictions. I think we're about to learn that that doesn't always hold true for the GLP-1 molecules that are out there. There's being a considerable amount of pushback. You can imagine that you have a biologic in a small patient population that you might get a few restrictions on it. And if you have a gene therapy for a tiny patient population, you might find the compound to be very highly restricted and have to enter into things like what are called value-based agreements, which are starting to show up in the US's potentially Inflation Reduction Act about like you have to prove that a drug works, and after 6 months, if it only works to a certain percent, the pharma company is paying that back to the payer, the government. But you can't guess forever. Investors will only tolerate so much guessing. And so what you often will do with the TPP is you put it in front of actual payers and you'll ask them, what do you think? What would your restrictions be? So you can go back, you can plan for your restrictions for commercialization, and you can also go back to your investors. This is an actual slide we used about 2 weeks ago for a biologic for rare neuromuscular disease in the US, and we do the same thing you do for Europe, but we got a bunch of payers together, and here's just a list of like who they were in their organization, what their organization does, and what their plans cover, and how many lives each plan covers. And we put the TPP in front of them for this product, and we said, what do you think? We said, what do you think you would do in terms of reimbursing it? What do you think you would do in terms of restricting it? We didn't ask about the price, but they always give you their opinion anyway, which is fine. What they would potentially reimburse up to, for example, and you get information back from them like this. They will say to you, well, you know what? Great therapy, high unmet need, nothing effective and safe is out there. But here are some things we'd like to see. We'd like to see your study be placebo controlled. This is very important in Europe also. We want to know like more about the scale that you use in your study. Agnostic of what your thought leaders might think, we think that this is an acceptable improvement over the drug versus placebo. We'd like you to not have to, patients to not have to come into clinic to administer the drug, but have a self-administration. We'd like to have greater control over how we pay for it, meaning putting it under a pharmacy benefit instead of a medical benefit, which is just a way of categorizing how payments are made in the US. And then we're going to want to know things like, how hard is this going to be on our budget? And should we allow it for a year? And if we do allow it for a year, then would you have to reauthorize it after that? Or should we have our healthcare practitioners do this scale at the beginning to show that patients are severely affected enough for us to reimburse it, and then do the scale again 6 months later to see if it's actually working? And these are the kinds of things that they will do to control the levers.
Hey, Ray.
Knowing this, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. I got a quick question. This was really, really interesting, that especially the previous slide about the same topic, asking all these payers or payer decision makers their thoughts. I'm just curious, what was the format? Was it, so I have two questions. One, when you provide the TPP, I mean, how extensive is it? I told you, I worked, when I was in pharma, I worked twice on these ad hoc TPP committees, and
Mm-hmm.
they can be pretty long and detailed. I'm just curious, and such that it would take quite a while to read it unless you had an executive summary. And so my first
Yep.
question is, what are they provided? How rich or deep is the information that they're
Mm-hmm.
getting from you? And then the second
Good.
question, which is related but different, is what was the forum? Do you just email it to them and they email you their answers? Or
Mm-hmm.
did you email it to them, then you have a phone call and they get to just answer off the top of their heads rather than having to write something down? I'm just
Yeah.
interested in like the mechanics
Yep.
of getting this
Good
sort of
questions.
customer discovery from 5 different customers. Thanks.
Good questions. So the first one is they're blinded. So they have no idea who the company is, who the product is, who whatever. So as much as we can, they don't know exactly who it is. Now, if they were smart enough, they could kind of figure it out sometimes because there's one product out there in clinical development, but it's blinded. What we give them, we do send them materials in advance so that they have an opportunity to look through it and think about it in the context of their plan. And oftentimes, if you tell them the disease state, they'll go back into their own plan and say, oh, of our 20 million members, we've got 100,000 with this disease. And so they're already starting to think about like what the impact of the drug could be. The information you give them, there's kind of a core set of basic information, like what's the indication, what's the patient population, what's the current treatment flow, what's the standard of care, things like that. They'll go back to their own formularies and see what's preferred, what's not preferred, for example. And then a lot of it, then it becomes very specific for the company. So this particular company was wondering about adoption of administration in the office versus at home. And so you ask very specific questions. What are your thoughts on that? And the way you do it is when you email the TPP. Usually you give them access to a data room so they can't, distribute. And they're all held under confidential disclosure, and they're all paid, by the way. They're paid advisors. And then you either meet with them one-on-one for an hour, hour and a half, and you go through everything, you talk to them, or you meet with them. In Europe, we do this more often. You meet with them as a group. So you meet with them as like 5 or 6 people from representative countries, usually UK, France, Germany, Spain, and Italy. And then you throw in a Nordic, just because you do, I guess. And you get feedback from them.
Got it.
And then
Okay, thanks for
that's
that.
what turns into this.
Thank you.
And why that's important and why we do this early is because you want to get the feedback early enough to make a change in your program if you need to. So if, like on the last slide, they said, this is really interesting, but we'd like to see a placebo-controlled study. And you say, oh, yes, maybe we should do a placebo-controlled study. What I often see in Europe is the European health technologies assessors will say, we want to see these 2 measures, these 2 scales in your study, because that will help us understand what the quality adjusted life year is. It's a metric they use to determine like how much they should be paying for things across all therapeutic areas, diabetes, depression, cancer, whatever. And they'll say, put this in your trial. So if you hear that from the payers early on, you put that in your trial. Sometimes they'll say perform additional studies. I had the unfortunate experience once of feedback where the US wanted to see one type of study and Europe wanted to see another type of study. One was a placebo-controlled and the other was non-inferiority against standard of care. It was Europe who wanted non-inferiority against standard of care because that's how they think. And so you had to reboot the clinical program. And then the other one I think that we're starting to see a lot more of is payers want to see real world evidence because their membership are members of the real world. They are not in clinical studies. I mean, some of them are, but the people who will be getting the drug are not those people. And a question we get frequently is what's the standard of care and how well does the standard of care work in the real world? And there are lots of studies that you can do, that we do, using patient charts, using claims databases, using a lot of other different registries, for example, to develop that evidence. These types of studies take years and they cost millions of dollars. And so for a company to know early on in their development that they need to do it is better. And the other thing, because of that, is that when investors come in and they see you haven't done any of this, they'll realize that, number one, they probably have to take on this work. And number two, as well-intentioned as some of these biotech companies may be, they hadn't prepared for the payer question, and now they're going to be behind getting reimbursed in Europe, certainly. So just to conclude, I wanted to make sure I left time for more questions. When you're putting together your TPPs and you get to the reimbursement part, depending on where you are in your clinical development program, you may want more or less information in there. If you're still in the lab, probably less. If you're about to start enrolling patients, you'll probably want more. Investors will definitely want to know. the landscape is consistently changing. The HTA regulations are changing. I actually think they're changing for the better, but they're going to make it a lot more work for these companies to do to get reimbursement, which is, in my opinion, a small price to pay to get reimbursement. US payers typically tend to not worry about this so much. Basically, they're focused on something called the per member per month, which is they'll look at the 20 million patients in their plan, realize they've got 100,000 of them, your drug costs $5,000 a year. Their annual member will have to pay 4 cents more per month. And then importantly, once you get the feedback, it's being ready to adjust the development program or generate new evidence. And this is something that we actually recommend to our clients that they do more than once, that they get feedback from the payers and then they change their program and they get feedback again and they get feedback again. Oh, sorry. Charles, one other thing I should mention when you asked me about how you do this. We don't actually, so in the US, it's a little bit different. In Europe, we're not actually allowed to talk to actual payers. So what we do is we talk to people who have been on these payer committees who are now themselves consultants. And so they no longer have decision-making authority in their country, but they can tell us how their country thinks.
Oh, I'm glad you added that. That's really interesting. The restriction against talking to actual, yeah, thanks for clarifying that. Thanks.
You're welcome. So that's just a nutshell, a run through. I'm more than happy to answer any questions, or if people have, as I mentioned, I'm also a Catalyst advisor. So if people have questions for me, random ones, I'm happy to answer them. I mean, now or later, like, tomorrow, next week, 2 months from now. I see people have hands up, and I think we've reached the end of my Zoom skills here. So let me see. I think it's Anji has a hand up.
Yeah. So this is a pretty rudimentary question, I think. For the same slide with payer and payer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, who are those agents? Are they pharma companies? Are they who are they representing? Are they representing the investor side? Are they representing the drug and development that team? Are they representing the regulators? Who are them?
Is your question when we talk to payers, who are we representing ourselves as in the company?
Oh, no, I'm asking who are those payers?
Oh, so it's in the United States, it's insurance companies. So it can be Kaiser, it can be Cardinal, it can be any sort of insurance company in the United States that is responsible for paying. We try to find someone who has previously worked at the CMS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, so they'll have some sense. In Europe, and it's people who have, we try to find people who have had senior leadership positions in those companies so they can speak to what the expectation would be. And then in Europe, every country has their own body responsible for payment. It's almost always completely centralized, although some countries you can get insurance outside of that. And it's a government body. So you actually, by law, have to go through first getting the drug approved and then go through these payer associations to get it reimbursed. That's a good question. And I think Vincent had his hand up.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question, by the way, Anji?
Yeah, and I have a follow-up, but feel free to answer Vincent's question first.
Okay.
Oh, no, you can go ahead and get that question out of the way.
Yeah, so you mentioned one point about drugs or devices that are still in the lab might want to disclose less for their PPP. What is the incentive for that?
So it's usually confidential. It's usually confidentiality on the part of the client. So the client would prefer that payers, because they're still kind of formulating an opinion about what their drug is going to do, and they're going to still they're going to go back and evaluate the payer feedback and put more information into that. They just want it to be confidential. It also protects the respondents in case they have potentially a financial interest in whatever company is providing the TPP to them. So it's really just a protection measure.
Okay, thank
for
you.
both. Yep, you're welcome.
Yeah, so my question was, I was really interested to hear about how different the landscape in Europe is for approval and reimbursement. So I assume that because of the high cost of developing drugs or healthcare devices, there's the goal to get it into as many markets as possible. But because of the restrictive or different nature of different countries' approval processes, are some drugs developed today only for certain markets and they give up other
Absolutely.
markets? I'm just really interested in this.
Absolutely. There's something that we call market sequencing,
Market.
and 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 the price question is fascinating because in Europe, if you get approved in Germany and Germany says your price is X, that becomes what's known as a reference price. And so every other market will look at it and say, well, wait a second, you said Germany was X. Why are you charging us Y? And so, and there's an entire work stream in pharma around, and there are countries that you want to go to first because the negotiations for the price are either shorter duration or they're easier, or there's an expectation that given your therapeutic area, you're going to get a more favorable price. So your reference price is higher on the higher end than it is on the lower end. In the US, what we typically do is we do analogs. So this neuromuscular drug that I mentioned before, when we get ready to talk about pricing, we'll take 4 or 5 drugs that are kind of in the same space, kind of have the same patient population, kind of have the same duration of treatment. There may be a biologic or something, and we'll benchmark against all of them. And we'll say, okay, payer, you're paying 10,000 a year for drug A, 12 for B, 13 for C. Where do you see this drug fitting in? That's a whole separate work stream on the commercial side of the organization, but it's a great question.
No, that's so fascinating. And then I could imagine there is a lot of strategy and like you just brought up a lot of ideas in my head about choosing these
Yeah.
different countries or finding different analogs. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Great question. Alareza, I think, had the next hand that I can see.
Yes. So thank you for the nice presentation. My question was that, so based on what I understood, the insurance companies wouldn't make money on accepting reimbursing a new drug. So they're actually like paying more. So maybe if on the earliest stage of developing a new medication, if we focus on, or if you focus on reducing the secondary complications of diseases, or maybe reducing these complications of the current standard of care, do you think this would give us more negotiation power in with them later? Because then we can tell them, if you accept reimbursing this drug and your customers or people who are like in this insurance take this drug, they will need less drugs later for other drugs later. So you're gonna make money more later. They gotta save more money for them. Is this a new good understanding that I took, or I'm wrong?
I think it was kind of breaking up on me a little bit, but I'll try and answer what I thought I heard, which was about so when you're developing drugs, there are a lot of drugs out there that treat the symptoms of disease. It's very compelling to find a drug that treats the actual cause of the disease, and payers will almost always go for that. What a payer will do, though, for every single drug, and you give them what's called a budget impact model, and you will tell them, this is the price we're going to set, and they plug it into what's essentially a very fancy Excel spreadsheet using their own plan and their own tiering, and they'll spit out a number that says how much this drug is going to cost. For for drugs that treat very rare diseases that are very expensive, a plan may have 2 patients in their entire membership, and they're not even going to notice $1 million drug, so to speak. This is where the GLP-1s are getting really interesting, because there's a lot of people out there who could benefit from these drugs, and these drugs are very expensive. And so the first wave was, great, we'll put these on formulary, and now they're looking at the impact and saying, hold on a second, I don't think we can afford this. So again, I'm sorry, I had a little trouble hearing the question, so I hope maybe someone heard it better than I could, or did that kind of get to what your question was?
Yes, I think I got the idea and then the keyword that I can search for about. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So Ray, we're over time, but I had a quick question along those lines around, you hear a lot about pricing strategy around how much is it costing the insurers now, right? So then you kind of try to position yourself, you're going to save X dollars. At what point do you guys do that exercise? Do you present that when you're doing the key opinion leader discussions or later?
So for you kind of do it, so you do it fairly early to get a sense of where their heads are at and where the analogs are. But you really do it like maybe 6 months before launch, when you're really starting to kind of nail down the price, because you'll always keep like a ballpark price in the back of your head of where it's going to be based on the analogs. But when you feel really comfortable about what your price is going to be, then you would start to do more detailed research, and that becomes super secretive, because that's when you really kind of lock down like what you're going to say about the price and everything, because then it's kind of revealed at the end. And there have been some really remarkable failures of companies lately who have completely gotten the price wrong, and the backlash against them was incredible. And those of us who have been doing this for a while look at them and say, what were they thinking? Like, why did they go in with that? But it's kind of an ongoing process throughout development, I would say. But really, the benchmarking is the thing. And it's funny because the same is sort of true with a lot of FDA approvals. Like, your benchmarking is, what has the FDA approved before? And it's easier if they're working with something they know than something that's new. Although the FDA, I lately, especially with the real world evidence, is doing an incredible job of being cutting edge with a lot of work that they do, in my opinion.
Right, thanks.
Okay, Pei Heng, go for your question. Thank you.
Okay, sweet. Thank you. Yeah, so you just mentioned about like around maybe 6 weeks prior to launch, you start looking at your price. But I think at some point you also mentioned, oh, you probably want to look into like real world evidence. But to my knowledge, I feel like real world evidence is something you conduct like post launch or like post market, right? So given that, if you have like real world evidence post launch, post market launch, how are you still able to adjust your price after that?
Good question. So the first question, you actually start looking at your price a lot sooner than that. You start to have an idea around, so this company that I mentioned is probably not going to launch for 2 or 3 more years. But they know that they've already started to get an idea of what will be an acceptable price, and they will refine that price over time. So they might get feedback later to say that the price should be different, or there's been a new market entrant, or it's in a different line of therapy. So the pricing work actually starts pretty early, but weeks before you really start to kind of nail down what the exact price is going to be. With respect to real world evidence is important, not necessarily for the drug that's approved, but for all the other standard of care that's around it. So for example, I have one client where I'm actually setting up a registry for them where their drug is not going to be approved for 4 more years, but they don't know how well the standard of care works because it's a pretty rare disease. And so they need to generate some evidence on how well the standard of care works, because once they get to EMA, and definitely once they get to the payers are going to want that evidence. And they're going to want to say, okay, your drug reduces this by 2 points. What does, in this case, IVIG do to the same patient population? The other thing that real world evidence is important for is once you know what the standard of care is that patients are getting, you can know how much that costs. So you can go back to a payer and say, for your patients with XYZ, for example, their cost of payment is this, and because they have this adverse event, and our drug shows that you don't have this adverse event, and so therefore our drug is this much more cost effective. And that's what a lot of the Europeans like. I think the Inflation Reduction Act, there's some language in there around value, which is probably where things are going to head a little bit in the US, which I honestly think is a pretty good idea to keep some of the healthcare costs down. But yeah, you collect, and the other thing I would say about real world evidence too, is that for a lot of the drugs I work on rare disease and oncology mostly. Most of the clinical trials for that are single arm, not placebo controlled, and so you can't know what the standard of care is and how it compares to that unless you go out and get it.
Okay, sweet. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay. On behalf of the Catalyst program, I just want to thank Ray for really thought-provoking. I learned so much from that talk, and it's great. So thanks so much, Ray.
My
I want to thank you
pleasure. I
all
love
for
talking about it.
joining. And the next workshop will be next Wednesday. We have 3 guest speakers, all of which are great. I happen to know firsthand. So Linda McAllister, David Kim, and Akela Kuraharwa are going to talk about diagnostics, digital health and medical devices, and finally, gene and cell therapy. The focus of next week's workshop is how do you fill out the technical science, engineering, design, preclinical, clinical fields. Sort of like the nuts and bolts of how things work. Yeah, I guess that's it. So thank you all very, very much, and we'll see you in a week and 2 days, if not sooner. Okay, bye.